Let's talk about Dehancer and what my biggest gripe is with that tool. So like many of you, I want my video footage look like film. So with a quick Google search, I found a plugin called Dehancer.
The film look. There's a lot of ways you can try to emulate film, but the number one way is...
And also a lot of YouTubers did videos about Dehancer.
It's called Dehancer.
Dehancer Pro.
This video, I'm reviewing the Dehancer plugin
using Dehancer. Let's get started.
Coming from a film photography background and looking at the program, it's clear that it's trying to emulate a lot of the aspects of film photography. But when I watch some of these YouTube videos, they either just go through the sliders really quickly and don't explain what the sliders actually do, or they use it in a way that is just, let's say, I enabled this because it looks cool kind of way. And this is my biggest gripe with some of these videos, that they don't explain what these different options do and why I put the sliders in a certain way. So reach out to Dehancer and ask them if I could try their program, and they agreed. And stick to the end of the video because I got something special for you. So let's get back to the office and I'll show you the Dehancer plugin and what each section actually means and what the sliders actually do. Welcome back to the office. Let's get right into it, shall we? Okay, first off, let's talk about video footage. If your video footage is bad, Dehancer won't make it better. The plugin is there to enhance your footage, not to save it. This means you should correctly expose your video footage and ideally have a consistent white balance throughout your video clips. I mostly shoot my videos on my DJI Osmo Pocket 3, which you're seeing right now. And one of the benefits is that it shoots in 10-bit. 10-bit basically means that it has more color depth than 8-bit, but there's a great video from B&H which explains to you the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit. Also, the Pocket 3 shoots in D-Log, which basically means it shoots a flat image to capture more details in the shadows and in the highlights. Okay, now that we've filmed our footage, let's go straight into Final Cut Pro and I'll show you how to use it. Now we're in Final Cut Pro and you can open up the effects browser and you can scroll down or scroll up to the part where it says film emulation. Let's put on our first test footage. Let's take the footage here from the tennis court and pull it in here. And the first thing we're going to do is deactivate everything, and we go from top to bottom for each section. So now if we toggle Dehancer Pro on and off, you see there's no difference in the footage. By the way, another method is also to put an adjustment layer above your clip. I'll show you here. And drag Dehancer Pro onto the adjustment layer. Let's delete Dehancer Pro on the clip and we just work on the adjustment layer. And again, we deselecting everything. Okay. So if we activate and deactivate Dehancer, you shouldn't see any differences. Let's start from top to bottom. On the top right corner, you see input, and this is where you select your camera or your video format that you trying to color grade on. Since this clip is shot on the Osmo Pocket 3, we can choose as source camera, and then we choose the vendor of the camera, which is DJI, and I'm choosing the Osmo Pocket 3. Some cameras have multiple log formats, but here it's just D-Log-M. So the exposure compensations controls how bright or how dark the image is. If I drag it to the left, you see the image getting darker. If I drag it to the right, you see it's gonna be overexposed. And with the little arrow on the right side here, you can always reset the parameter. Then we have temperature control, which basically means the white balance. So if you drag it to the left, it's getting more blue. And if you drag it to the right, it's getting warmer and more into the yellow tones. Again, we reset that. And the tint defines how much magenta and how much green is in the image. So if we go to the right, we're going to introduce more of a magenta tint in the image. And we're going all the way to the left side, we see that the footage turns on more to the green. Let's reset the parameter again. Let's move on to the defringe section. Defringe in Dehancer helps with chromatic aberrations that are visible as color fringes or outlines typically appearing at the edge of objects, especially in high contrast areas. So in the manual it says that some of the effects in Dehancer can create chromatic aberrations, and you can use this panel to reduce the chromatic aberrations on the edges, and you can use this tool to reduce the chromatic aberrations on the edges. The next section, and probably the most easiest section, is the film section, and here you can choose from a variety of films. Toggle this on, you can see it starts from ADOX Color Implosion 100 to popular film stocks like CineStill 800T, going to black and white films like the Ilford HP5 and so on. You see here Kodak Portra 400, and for me typically I like to work with Kodak Vision 3 250D, and here you can see that on some tutorials out there, people who choosing these film stocks choose them for coolness factor, and here for me it's really important to state that if you're choosing one of the Kodak Vision 3 films, that you look at your footage when it's shot. For example, this shot of the tennis court was shot at broad daylight, and we go to the film selection, you see that Kodak Vision 3 has different options. It says here Kodak Vision 3 200T, 250D, 250T and 50D. When I shoot on broad daylight, I like to choose a film stock that is meant for broad daylight and not for artificial light. So the D stands for daylight. It's a 250 speed film for daylight. And if I have some footage at night with tungsten balanced lights, I would probably choose Kodak Vision 3 500T, which stands for tungsten. Let's choose Kodak Vision 250D. And if we enabled it, you can see that it applied the film look. Now there's a slide in these sections which states push and pull. And for those who don't know, push and pull is a process in film photography where if you push a film, you purposely overexpose your shot or your film and then tell the lab that you want to push that film so it's longer in the chemicals and it develops longer. And usually this introduces more contrast in your film. And on the other side, if we want to pull our film, we purposely underexpose our film and we let the lab know that we want to pull the film, so less time in the chemicals, which can result in a flatter looking film. So let's try this. If we go to the right, so we pull the film, you can see that it introduces a little bit of a more flat feel. And if we go and push it all the way to the left side, you can see that it adds a little bit more contrast. Good. Let's set it back to 0 because I neither want to push or pull the film. I have to say that this pull-push button is a little bit weird in Dehancer because in some film stocks it doesn't do the results that I'm expecting, so it doesn't the image more flat when I'm pulling. So you have to test the slider with the combination of the film and see what it will do. All right, so let's move on to the next section, which is the film develop section. Here we can see 4 different options. The contrast boost, as it says, controls the contrast of the image increasing and decreasing. So first let's enable it. So if we go to the right, we introduce a lot of contrast, and on the left, we taking contrast away, okay? And then we have gamma corrections, which is adjusting the contrast ratio on how the midtones are shifted towards the shadows or the highlights. So let's set both to 0 again. So let's go to the color separation slider. And when you reduce the color separation slider, it decreases the saturation of the most intense color. But in my experience, it doesn't do much. So let's go back to the video and pull in the footage of me wearing a jacket. And I always recommend you guys to have separate adjustment layers for different clips, because if you look at the footage right now, you can see that the white balance is a little bit off on this shot. Whereas if you go back on the shot with the tennis court, it looks okay. But for demonstration purposes, I just leave it here. And if you reduce the slider to the left, it's almost not noticeable. I can't really see the difference here. The next slider is color boost. So color boost increases or decreases the overall saturation of the image without causing clipping. So if you go here and pull the slider to the right, you see it introduces more color, especially in my jacket and in the skies. And if we go all the way to the right, you can see that even the skin color is now affected, but it looks a little bit weird right now. So I would definitely not overdo it with this slider and pull it a little bit back. Let's say around 45. That doesn't look really bad. Around 45, depending on what you like in your image. Okay, so the next section is the film compression part. So the first slide here is the impact one, which controls the degree of highlight compression. So let's go here into the slider and I just pull it to the right. You don't see much of a difference, but let's see what happens if I pull it all to the left. Do you see the difference here in the highlights? You see the clipping of the highlights on the pathway. Again, all the way to the right, all the way to the left. The next slide is the white point. The white point sets the film clipping threshold and affects overall contrast and compressed range. So again, if we play here with the slide, you can see, especially in the highlights on the horizon, and the tonal range, which determines the width of the tonal range affected by the compression. So if you see all the way to the right, it's all the way to the left. Just set it a little bit back to 30. Color density adjusts the color saturations in the highlights and mimicking how the film responds. So let's add more density to the right and to the left. You see, especially in my jackets, that there's a slight color boost. Again, here to alter the way to the left. Look for my jacket and then pull it to the right. That's film compression. Let's move on to the expand section. And here's where you control the black and white points of your image in relations to the output of your color space. So basically it helps you to control the overall contrast after applying the film profile. So again, if we push the slider on the black point to the right, we are adding more black into the shadow areas. You can see it really starts to crush the shadows. And on the other hand, if we go to the left, you see we are lifting up the shadow areas of the image. Put it back to 0. And on the white point, we see we're at 100% and we push it to the right. We're crushing the highlights. And if we go all the way to the left, we are overexposing and introducing more whites into the highlight areas. Reset it to 100. Color modes, you have two options: normal and luma. And in luma mode, it only affects the luminosity, so the brightness of the image, without changing the saturations. Make an example. So we have here normal mode. We switch to luma. You can see the saturation is not affected at all. And if we're changing it to normal on the grass and on my jacket, boosting the contrast, it's boosting the colors. Let's close up the expand. And so we only see the print section now. So I saw one video of a creator who thought that printing here means that you print something on your digital image. So the print section here in Dehancer emulates the optical printing process, and it used to create the final prints from a film negative or a film positive. And it basically allows you to add these characteristics of various print formats and adjust the settings here. So in very short, what these sliders will do, the exposure slider adjusts, of course, the brightness of the print. So let's enable it first. And the exposure slider affects the exposure and also affects the contrast in an analog manner. So if we push the slider to the right, you see it's not clipping the whites like in the expand section. And we go to the left, it's adding more contrast to the image and also darkens the shadow areas here. Let's reset the slider. And then we have the tonal contrast, which controls the contrast of the print in a non-linear way. And if we pull the slider to the right, you see it's impacting both punchiness and apparent exposure. And let's go to the color density slider. And this slider really impacts the colors in a significant way than the other sliders. So you see what I mean? If we go to the right, you see the colors popping, especially in the sky and on my jacket. And if I pull it to the left, it doesn't pull out all the saturation of the image, but it makes it more flat. And reset the slider, and then we have the saturation slider here, which is a more traditional saturation adjustment. So if we pull the slider all the way to the left, you see that it takes away all the colors of the image. Then with the analog range limiter, it uses the original black and white points from the analog prints instead of the digital range. So as you can see, it results in a softer image, and it improves the details in the darkest shadows, in the brightest highlights. And it provides us with a more film-like response. So on the top, you might realize that I skipped over one point, and that is the profile section here. And if you open up the drop-down menu, you can see 5 different options that we have here. I've set it now to the linear section, which is the pure profile of the selected film of Kodak Vision 250D, without the impact of the photographic paper characteristics. And then we have the different characteristics of the 4 papers, of the Cineon film log, the Fujifilm 3513, Kodak 2383, and the Kodak Endura glossy paper. The Kodak 2383, which is mostly used to print positive film stocks, and the other one, Kodak Endura glossy paper, was mainly used for film negatives. So we cycle between all of these profiles. You can see how it affects. And the last one is Kodak Endura glossy paper, which I'm going to use because I chose Kodak 250D, and I'm going to leave the analog range limiter on. You can see it's too contrasty for my liking. So in the color head section, Dehancer tries to emulate the color correction process done in traditional photo enlargers and optical movie printers. So let's activate it here, and let's see what happens when we pull on the yellow to blue slider. You see we're gonna introduce more yellow into the image, and on the other side we introduce more blues. And same with the other sliders, we introduce more magenta to the magenta side and green to the other side. Same with the cyan, color, and red. And if we enable the gang section here, and we simultaneously adjust the magenta, yellow, and cyan sliders by the same amount. And then also we can affect the tones in the shadows and the midtones and the highlights and the preserve exposure. And if it sets to 100%, it automatically compensates all the exposure changes introduced by these sliders up here. Setting it to 0 though results in exposure changes. So if we move it to the right, you see the image is getting brighter, and if we move it to the left, the image is getting darker. And if we set it again back to 100%, the exposure values should stay the same. And the impact slider controls the overall strength and opacity of the colored sliders here. Then next, probably the most interesting or most popular sections for you guys is the film grain. And if we enable it, we have different options to choose from, ranging from 8mm film to 65mm film. So a lot of these videos out there don't really explain why the grain is more apparent in 8mm film and less apparent in 65mm film, but it has all to do with the film sizes. So 8mm film size is really tiny, and so if you enlarge it, you see more of the film grain rather than on a 65mm film, which is huge, by the way, and so the film grain is much less apparent. The ISO value, if you're familiar with photography, should tell you something. So the smaller the ISO number, the less apparent the grain is, and the higher ISO value, the more apparent the film grain is. So for me, I wouldn't go below under 35mm film because the film grain is just too apparent. Rather choose 65mm and ISO 50, so a subtle film grain overall, but it really depends on the scene. So let's say if a night scene, I would introduce more grain just to make it more natural, because if you shoot at night, you have to use a higher ISO film, or if you have a digital camera, you dial up the ISO and you introduce more grain into the footage. Let's move on to the halation and the bloom section of the Dehancer plugin. So I want you to teach the difference between halation and bloom. Sometimes I see on the internet that this is somehow interchangeably used, but halation and bloom is created differently. So halation is coming from film photography, from a film base, where you have different layers of colors and anti-halation layer that stops the film from light strays. If you remove this anti-halation layer, so you get this orange glow around the bright light sources. So halation can only be created with the film medium. It cannot naturally be created in a digital camera. And bloom is something that is created within the lens when the light bleeds from the light areas to other parts of the image. So I'm going to show you this with a bloom filter. We have here 20% strength Cine bloom filter from Moment. And if I put this in front of the Osmo Pocket 3, hopefully you can see the difference, especially here in the highlights. I've put it away, so look at my hand here and you see the difference. So the light is really bleeding into my hand here, whereas if I take it away, the contrast between the light areas and the midtones are more visible. And again, if I put the mist filter in front of the Osmo Pocket 3, you can see the bright parts, the highlights is bleeding into the midtones and also sometimes into the shadow areas. And another important distinction between bloom and halation is that bloom is almost colorless. So again, if I put it in front of you, you see it doesn't cast any colors. And halation casts an orange to red glow around the bright light sources. If you want to know more about halation and bloom, there's a video I link on the top here where it's explained in detail what the difference is. But let's jump into Final Cut and see what it does. So we are here in Final Cut and we turn on the halation effect. You see the orange glow around me, which is a little bit weird to see, but I pulled another footage where it is naturally to have halation. Let's jump a little bit further in the timeline. And if you see the specks of orange here, the little glow here, this is where halation naturally occurs around these bright light sources. And if you deactivate the adjustment layer, you can see the difference, or we just deactivate the halation layer, you can see the difference. And also here we have the different film sizes. So if we go to the different film sizes, you're gonna see different halation strength. So the smaller the film size, the stronger the halation is going to be. So if we go to 8mm, Super 8 has a stronger halation effect than the 65mm, 70mm halation here. Then if we turn on the bloom effect and we go down to Super 8, you can see the effect is gonna have that overall everything bleeds more from the highlights into the midtones without casting any orange red tones. And if we switch to 65mm, you can clearly see that the highlight bleed is much less apparent than on 8mm. I turned off the halation and bloom because I find it sometimes it's a little bit too much, so don't overdo it and use it in situation where halation would naturally occur. But I would suggest you to use bloom over halation because it's more common to see bloom rather than halation. Let's move on to the film damage section and hide the other sections here. So film damage in Dehancer tries to emulate imperfections on film, such as dust, hair and scratches. And by adding these flaws, giving your digital footage a more authentic and analog feel by replicating the wear and tear of the inherent medium of film. So let's enable it in Final Cut Pro. If we choose 8mm, it's more apparent rather than in 65mm. So let's go back and put in 65 and let's play it again. You see here, it's much less apparent again than on 8mm. Let's disable it. I usually don't use film damage at all. So film breath in Dehancer tries to emulate the accidental changes in exposure, contrast, and colors from frame to frame that can occur when shooting film. This effect caused by inconsistencies in the analog process contributes to a more organic and analog feel. So let's activate it here in Dehancer, and again, with all the other options here, the lower you go with the film size, the more apparent it is. Let's see it at 8mm, and you can really see the shifts in the red tones here. And then let's go and switch it up to 65mm, which should be more subtle. Okay, let's play it. As expected, it's less apparent than in 8mm. But again, I usually don't use these effects. I sometimes put in the bloom for a little effect, but otherwise I probably never use film damage. I probably never use film breath. So gate width in Dehancer Pros emulates the slight random movements and jitters from film as it passes through the cameras or the projector. This effect is caused by mechanical inconsistencies of the analog equipment and has a subtle organic breathing quality to digital footage. Alright, so let's activate it and see how it looks like in 8mm. So yeah, as you see here, It's really apparent. You see the jitter and random movements. And let's switch it up to 65mm, and yeah, you can see that the jitter is much smaller and you almost can't see it at 65. Alright, so the last one is the Overscan, and this is where you can add film borders to your footage. So let's activate it and enable it here. So you have Super 35, I think you guys should know 8mm, this is really popular. Then you have the gauge shape, so you have the normal shapes, you can have it sharp and rounded, and all of these different options. I would suggest you just go through it, and perforation mode, negative and positive, or just turn it off altogether. Also with this effect, I usually don't use it. Maybe as a gimmick or for a transition, I would activate it, but otherwise I just leave it off. Let's move on to one of the last sections here, the vignette one. This effect I usually turn on. This gives a subtle vignetting, so you can darken the corners a little bit, and you set up the exposure here. You can turn it all the way down to -2, and I think this is too much of a vignette effect. Or you can also overexpose the corners, which my personal preference I would never do. You can play with the size of your vignettes. So with 0, you have almost the whole entire frame vignetted, and if you go all the way to the right side, the vignette goes all the way back to the corners. The feather is self-explanatory, so you can see here the circle where the vignette is, and if you go all the way to 100%, you can't see the edge anymore. And also the aspect ratio. Do you want it horizontally, you want it round or vertically? Yes, but I usually like a round vignette around my footage. Then with the monitor, this is a really cool feature of Dehancer where you can see the false colors. Just turn it on and it shows you which areas are exposed to what value. I won't go into the details of false colors. There are a ton of videos out there that make a much better job than me explaining how false colors works, but if you need it, it is here. And with the clipping indication, it shows you where in the image the shadows are clipping, so where no information is left. And if you turn it on, you can see with blue where these areas are. Then let's move on to output. So the output slide here controls the overall effect of the Dehancer plugin. If you think you have your setting dialed in, but it's a little bit too punchy or a little bit too strong, and you want to dial back the look, you can do that with this slider. Let's say you want to have it at 50%, just dial it down to 50%. That's that. And LUT Generator allows you to export the color and contrast characteristics of your Dehancer grading. So that's it from the Dehancer video. I hope you liked it. I hope I could explain every single slider to you. I'm sure I missed some sliders or I missed some options. Please let me know down in the comments below. If I should do a follow-up video, or if you have any questions, put it down below. And last but not least, thank you to Dehancer for providing me with the software. They were kind enough to give you guys all a 10% off of their software with the code down in the description, so make sure to use that at the checkout. And again, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you guys in the next video.